The shipping container smelled like rust and old memories. Daniel Reed sat on the edge of his narrow bed, watching dust particles float through the single shaft of afternoon light that cut across his living space. 3 years had passed since the war ended. 3 years since humanity declared victory over the Kavrath Collective. 3 years since Daniel stopped feeling like a person and started feeling like a ghost walking through other people's lives. His hands shook as he tied his work boots. They always shook in the mornings, sometimes in the afternoons too. The doctors had names for what was wrong with him, long medical terms that meant his brain couldn't forget the things he wished it would. Combat medic, they called him during the war. Hero, they called him after. Broken, he called himself now. The settlement of New Portland spread out beyond his container home like a promise he couldn't believe in. New buildings rose every week. Children played in the streets. People smiled and talked about the future as if the past could just be packed away in boxes and forgotten. Daniel pulled on his jacket and stepped outside, keeping his eyes down as he walked toward the spaceport. Work was simple. Load cargo, unload cargo, move containers from one place to another. The supervisor stopped asking Daniel to join the crew for lunch months ago. They stopped inviting him to the celebration events too. He preferred it that way. Conversations required energy he didn't have. Smiling felt like lying. It was easier to just move through the day like water flowing downhill, following the path of least resistance until night came, and he could return to his container and wait for morning. The spaceport buzzed with activity. Ships came and went, bringing supplies from Earth and the outer colonies. Progress, everyone called it. Building the future. Daniel just saw metal and cargo and people who talked too loud. He scanned his work badge and headed for the loading docks, ready for another day of not thinking, not feeling, not being anyone at all. But halfway through his shift, something changed. Daniel was moving a pallet of medical supplies when he heard voices from the research facility attached to the spaceport. The door was propped open for ventilation and words drifted out into the loading area. "We can't keep it much longer," a woman's voice said. "It's not eating. The aggression is getting worse. What about the university? Could they take it?" This voice was male, tired. "They don't have the facilities. And honestly, I think it's suffering. Might be kindest to put it down tomorrow morning." Daniel's hand stopped moving. His heart, which usually beat in a dull, steady rhythm that barely registered as life, suddenly pounded against his ribs. Put it down. Medical language for killing. Clinical words for ending a life because it was convenient. Because it was easier than trying harder. Because some things were too broken to fix. He knew that feeling. The rest of his shift passed in a blur. Daniel's mind kept circling back to that conversation. Some kind of animal, clearly. Something injured or sick. Something they'd given up on. As the sun set and other workers headed home or to the bars or to their families, Daniel found himself walking not toward his container, but toward the research facility. His military credentials still worked. Nobody had bothered to revoke his access codes even though he'd resigned from active service the moment the war ended. The door beeped green and opened. Inside, the facility was quiet. Most of the scientists had gone home. Only a few lab lights glowed in the distance. Daniel moved through hallways he'd walked during the war when this place had been a field hospital. His boots echoed on the tile floors. He followed the signs toward the holding area, not sure what he was doing or why, just knowing that he couldn't let tomorrow morning come without at least looking. The holding cells were in the basement level, reinforced walls, heavy doors with small observation windows. 3 cells stood empty. The 4th held something that made Daniel stop breathing. A dragon. The word came to his mind immediately, even though he'd never seen anything like it before. The creature was the size of a large horse covered in scales that shifted between deep blue and gray in the dim light, wings folded against its sides. A long tail curled around its body. One back leg was held at an awkward angle, and Daniel could see infection spreading from a deep wound in the creature's side. But it was the eyes that held him, frozen. The dragon watched him through the reinforced glass with an intelligence that was unmistakable, not the blank stare of an animal, not the rage the scientists had described, just exhaustion, just pain, just the look of something that had survived but didn't know why. Daniel recognized that look. He saw it every morning in his mirror. His medical training kicked in before his mind could catch up. He moved to the control panel and studied the sedation protocols. His hands, which had shaken that morning, were steady now. Muscle memory from 1,000 emergency situations took over. He calculated dosages, prepared equipment, and made a choice that surprised him. He was going to help this creature. Not because anyone asked him to. Not because it was his job. But because for the first time in 3 years, something cut through the fog in his mind and made him feel something other than numb. The dragon's eyes followed him as he entered the holding cell with the sedation injector. Daniel moved slowly, talking in a low, steady voice the way he used to talk to soldiers in shock. "I know you're scared. I know it hurts. But I'm going to help you if you let me." The dragon could have killed him. Its claws were as long as knives. Its teeth could have torn him apart. But instead it watched him approach and then slowly, almost carefully, lowered its head. Daniel pressed the injector against the dragon's shoulder and pushed the plunger. The creature's eyes stayed locked on his for a long moment before the sedation took effect and they slowly closed. As the dragon's breathing deepened into unconscious sleep, Daniel opened his medical kit and got to work. The wound was infected badly. He cleaned it, debrided the dead tissue, applied antibiotics. His hands moved with practiced precision. For hours he worked, treating not just the visible injury but checking for others, making sure the creature was hydrated, comfortable. And as he worked, he talked. Words he'd never said to anyone spilled out in the quiet of that holding cell. He talked about the soldiers he couldn't save, about the guilt that woke him at night, about how victory felt like ash in his mouth when so many good people had died to achieve it, about how he didn't know how to live in a world at peace when his mind was still at war. The dragon slept through his confession, but Daniel felt something shift inside him anyway. A small crack in the wall he'd built around himself. Not much, not enough to call it healing, but enough to let in a thin ray of light. When the scientists arrived the next morning, they found Daniel asleep on the floor next to the dragon, his hand resting near the creature's head. The dragon's fever had broken. The infection was retreating. And for the first time since its capture, the creature was resting peacefully. The head researcher stood in the doorway, staring at the impossible scene before her. Daniel woke to find a dozen eyes on him. He stood slowly, his body stiff from sleeping on concrete. "Give me a week," he said, his voice rough from disuse and too much talking in the night. "Just 1 week. Let me see if it can recover." The scientists looked at each other, looked at the dragon, looked at Daniel, who was really looking at them for the first time, meeting their eyes instead of staring past them. 1 week, the head researcher finally said. Daniel nodded and turned back to the dragon. Its eyes were open now, watching him again. And in that gaze, Daniel saw something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Purpose. Day 3, and the dragon still wouldn't eat. Daniel sat cross-legged on the floor of the holding cell with 5 different food options spread around him like offerings to an ancient god. Fresh fish from the settlement market. Raw meat from the local bird species. Dried protein bars, vegetables, even some of the processed food from Earth that supposedly everything found palatable. The dragon, who Daniel had started calling Ash in his mind, simply watched him with those unsettling, intelligent eyes and ignored every option. "You're going to make me look bad," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice light even though worry gnawed at his stomach. "I promised them a week. We're almost halfway through and you haven't eaten anything. They're going to say I'm wasting everyone's time." Ash tilted his head slightly, processing the words, or at least the tone. The wound on the dragon's side looked better. The infection was clearing. But without food, the creature would weaken regardless of how well Daniel treated the injury. Daniel picked up the fish and moved closer. Ash's nostrils flared, taking in the scent, but the dragon made no move to eat. Instead, the creature made a low sound, almost like a question. "I don't understand," Daniel admitted, setting the fish down. "I'm trying to help you. Why won't you help yourself?" The question hung in the air, and Daniel realized with a jolt that he could be asking himself the same thing. How many times had his sister Claire called him? How many messages had he deleted? Without reading? How many opportunities to reconnect with his old squad, to get therapy, to do something other than exist in a state of barely alive had he ignored? "We're quite a pair," he said quietly, "both too stubborn to accept help even when we need it." Daniel spent the rest of that day trying different approaches. He tried hand-feeding, tried leaving the food and walking away to remove the pressure of being watched, tried crushing the... fish into smaller pieces in case the dragon's jaw was injured. Nothing worked. By the time the scientist came to check on them that evening, Daniel felt defeat settling over him like a familiar coat. Still not eating? The head researcher, Dr. Lin, peered through the observation window with concern. No, the wound is healing well, but without nutrition. Daniel didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what it meant. Maybe it's the environment, Dr. Lin suggested. Predators like this usually hunt. Maybe it doesn't recognize dead food as edible. Something clicked in Daniel's mind. Can I take it outside? Just to the containment yard? Dr. Lin hesitated. That's a significant risk. It's also the best chance we have. After an hour of safety briefings and signing more waivers than seemed reasonable, Daniel led Ash through the facility to the outdoor containment area. The space was designed for studying larger specimens, surrounded by high walls and energy barriers. Trees grew at one end, transplanted from the nearby forest. A small stream ran through the middle. Ash stepped into the outdoor space and transformed. The sluggish, defeated creature from the cell suddenly became alert. The dragon's head lifted, nostrils flared wide, wings rustled against scales. For a long moment, Ash simply stood there, breathing in the open air as if remembering what freedom tasted like. Then the dragon moved. Not toward the food Daniel had brought outside, toward the stream. Ash's movements were still careful, favoring the injured side, but there was purpose in them now. The dragon waded into the shallow water and dunked its head completely under. When Ash surfaced, water streamed from scales that suddenly seemed brighter, more vibrant. Daniel watched, fascinated, as the dragon performed what could only be called a bathing ritual, washing, scrubbing with clawed feet, even spreading wings to let water sluice over the membranes. When Ash finally emerged from the stream, the transformation was remarkable. This wasn't the same defeated creature from the cell. This was something wild and alive, and hungry. Ash's eyes fixed on movement near the tree line. One of the local birds, small and quick, pecked at the ground searching for insects. In a burst of speed that made Daniel stumble backward, the dragon pounced. It was over in seconds. Ash ate with efficient brutality, and when the meal was finished, those intelligent eyes turned to Daniel with what might have been satisfaction. You needed to hunt, Daniel said, understanding flooding through him. You needed to feel like yourself. They stayed in the containment yard for hours that day. Daniel sat on a bench and watched Ash explore every corner of the space. The dragon investigated the trees, tested the walls with careful claws, practiced spreading wings that had been cramped in the small cell, and gradually, cautiously, Ash began to approach Daniel, not all at once, not directly. The dragon would investigate something near Daniel, then move away, circle closer, then retreat, testing boundaries, building trust one careful step at a time. Daniel understood this dance. He'd done the same thing after the war, keeping people at arm's length, never letting anyone too close, always ready to retreat behind his walls. Take your time, he told Ash. I'm not going anywhere. By the time they returned to the holding cell that evening, something between them had shifted. Ash no longer watched Daniel with wary suspicion. The dragon seemed almost relaxed, settling into sleep with less tension in its body. Daniel returned to his shipping container that night feeling different, lighter somehow. He opened his messages, and for the first time in months actually read one from Claire. Danny, I know you probably won't read this, but I miss you. Not the hero everyone wants you to be, just you. My brother. The guy who used to make terrible jokes and steal my dessert. He's still in there somewhere, right? I hope you find him again. Daniel's finger hovered over the reply button. He wasn't ready for a conversation. Wasn't ready to explain where he'd been or what he'd been doing. But maybe he could send something small. Something true. I'm trying, he typed. Found something worth showing up for. We'll explain later. Miss you too. He hit send before he could second-guess himself, then lay back on his bed and stared at the ceiling. For the first time in longer than he could remember, sleep came without a fight. The remaining days of the week passed in a blur of small victories. Ash started eating regularly once Daniel ensured daily time in the containment yard. The dragon's wound closed cleanly. Strength returned to the injured leg, and their communication became almost uncanny. Daniel learned that Ash had distinct vocalizations for different needs. A low rumble meant contentment. A sharp chirp signaled alarm. A questioning trill meant curiosity. In return, Ash learned to recognize Daniel's moods, becoming still and quiet when Daniel's hands shook with anxiety, more playful when Daniel seemed calm. On the 7th day, Dr. Lin observed them together in the containment yard. Daniel sat reading on his tablet while Ash lounged in the sun nearby. To any casual observer, they looked almost peaceful, comfortable. "You've done remarkable work, Doctor," Lin said when Daniel joined her at the observation station. "The healing is complete. Ash is healthy, strong, ready for release." The words hit Daniel harder than expected. He'd known this was coming, had known from the start that success meant letting go. But knowing didn't make it easier. "When?" he asked. "End of the month. We'll take Ash deep into the forest territories, far from the settlement. Hopefully the creature can reintegrate with others of its kind." Daniel nodded, not trusting his voice. That night he sat with Ash in the holding cell one last time before the move to prepare for release. The dragon's head rested near Daniel's leg, heavy and warm. "You're going home soon," Daniel said softly. "Back to the forest. Back to being what you're meant to be." Ash made a low sound that might have been sadness or understanding or both. "I wish I knew where my home was," Daniel continued, the words coming easier in the dark. "I thought it was with my squad, but most of them are gone. I thought it was in the work, but I can't go back to medicine without seeing all the people I failed. I thought maybe it was just not existing too much, but that's not really living, is it?" The dragon shifted closer, and Daniel felt the steady rhythm of Ash's breathing. In and out. Simple. Present. Alive. "Maybe home isn't a place," Daniel said, more to himself than to Ash. "Maybe it's just finding something that makes you want to wake up the next day." He fell asleep there, leaning against scales that were warm from the day's sun, and dreamed not of war but of flying. The transport vehicle sat ready at dawn, its cargo area modified with padding and ventilation for a living passenger. Daniel checked the straps for the 3rd time, knowing he was stalling but unable to stop himself. Around him, the research team made final preparations for Ash's release, their voices professionally cheerful in the way people get when trying to make something difficult feel normal. 3 weeks had passed since that first night in the holding cell. 3 weeks of daily visits, of learning Ash's language and teaching his own, of quiet moments that felt more real than anything Daniel had experienced since the war ended. And now it was ending. Had to end. Keeping Ash confined would be cruel, and Daniel had seen enough cruelty to last several lifetimes. "You ready?" Dr. Lin asked, adjusting her field equipment. Daniel wasn't sure if she was asking about the transport or about saying goodbye, so he just nodded. They brought Ash out in the pre-dawn darkness when the settlement was still mostly asleep. The dragon moved calmly, no longer needing restraints or sedation, simply following Daniel like this was just another morning routine. But Ash's eyes were different today, alert, anticipatory, as if the dragon could smell the forest on the wind and knew what was coming. The ride to the release site took 2 hours, deep into the mountain forest that humanity hadn't yet explored. Daniel sat in the back with Ash, one hand resting on the dragon's shoulder, memorizing the texture of scales and the warmth of living muscle underneath. "You're going to do great," Daniel said quietly, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince Ash or himself. "This is what you need. Open sky, room to fly, others like you." Ash made a low trill that Daniel had learned meant uncertainty. "I know change is scary, but scary doesn't mean wrong." He wondered if he should take his own advice. The release site was a clearing at the forest's edge, surrounded by old-growth trees that stretched toward a sky just beginning to lighten with sunrise. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks touched with gold. It was beautiful in a way that made Daniel's chest ache, reminding him that the world contained more than just the darkness he'd been carrying. The team unloaded their equipment and set up monitoring devices. The plan was to track Ash for the first few weeks, making sure the dragon successfully reintegrated. Dr. Lin ran through her checklist with practiced efficiency, but her eyes kept moving to Daniel, watching him the way the medical staff used to watch soldiers before difficult surgeries. "We can do this quickly," she said gently. "Or we can give you time to say goodbye. Your choice." Daniel appreciated the kindness but shook his head. "Quick is better, for both of us." He led Ash to the center of the clearing. The dragon's head swiveled, taking in the forest, the mountains, the endless sky. Wings rustled with barely contained energy. This was the right decision. Daniel could see it in every line of Ash's body. The dragon belonged here, not in a cell, not even in the containment yard. Here with space to be wild and free and fully alive. "Thank you," Daniel said, his voice rougher than intended, "for reminding me what it feels like to care about something." He stepped back, removing the monitoring collar that was the last piece of equipment connecting Ash to human control. The dragon stood still for a moment, looking at Daniel with those impossibly intelligent eyes, and then turned toward the forest. But Ash didn't run, didn't leap into flight and disappear like the team expected. Instead, the dragon walked a few paces, stopped, and looked back, waiting. "Go on," Daniel said, his throat tight. "It's okay. You're free." Ash took a few more steps, then stopped again. Wings spread slightly, an invitation or a question. The morning sun caught the edges of those wings and made them glow like stained glass. Daniel felt something pull in his chest, something that felt like recognition or maybe hope. "I can't come with you. That's not how this works." But even as he said it, part of him wanted to. Part of him wanted to walk into that forest and leave behind the shipping container and the settlement, and all the ways he'd been slowly disappearing. Part of him wanted to follow this creature who had somehow reached through 3 years of numbness and made him feel something real. The standoff lasted maybe 30 seconds, but felt longer. Then Ash did something none of them expected. The dragon lowered its body, wings spreading flat in the exact posture it used when settling down to rest in the containment yard. But the intent was different this time. The position was clear, an invitation. "Is that dragon asking him to ride?" one of the technicians whispered. Dr. Lin moved to Daniel's side, her voice low. "This is your call. We have no protocol for this. No data on whether these creatures bond with humans or if this is just confusion from captivity." Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs. His hands shook, but not from trauma this time. From possibility. From the terrifying, exhilarating question of what happens when you say yes to something you can't explain or control. "What if I fall?" he asked, the question encompassing so much more than physical safety. Ash made the low rumble that meant contentment, comfort, trust. Daniel walked forward on legs that felt disconnected from his body. He reached Ash and paused, giving both of them one last chance to reconsider. Then he climbed onto the dragon's back, finding handholds in the ridge of scales along the spine, feeling the powerful muscles shift beneath him. Ash rose slowly, giving Daniel time to adjust, to find his balance. Then the dragon's wings spread wide, blocking out the sun, and with a thrust that Daniel felt through his entire body, they launched into the air. Flying was nothing like Daniel imagined. It was wind and muscle, and the ground falling away at a speed that should have been terrifying, but somehow wasn't. Ash's wings beat with steady rhythm, carrying them up past the treetops, past the clearing, up toward the mountains that had seemed so distant from the ground. Daniel's initial fear dissolved into something he'd forgotten existed. Wonder. Pure, uncomplicated, childlike wonder. The world spread beneath them like a map, forests and rivers and the settlement in the distance looking small and manageable from this height. The morning sun painted everything gold and red, and the air was cold and clean in a way that made Daniel's lungs feel bigger, like he could finally breathe properly after years of shallow, careful breaths. They flew for what might have been minutes or hours. Time felt different up here, measured in heartbeats and wing strokes instead of seconds ticking toward an inevitable end. Ash climbed higher, showing Daniel cloud layers that looked solid enough to walk on, showing him the curve of the planet at the edge of vision, showing him a perspective that made everything he'd been carrying feel suddenly impossibly small. And then Ash dove. Daniel's stomach lurched as they plummeted through layers of air, wings tucked close, speed building until the world was just a blur of color and sensation. He should have been terrified. Should have been certain this was how he died. Instead, he found himself laughing. The sound ripped away by the wind as something that had been locked tight in his chest for 3 years finally broke open. They leveled out above a hidden valley Daniel had never known existed. A waterfall tumbled from the mountainside into a crystal-clear lake. Caves dotted the cliff faces, and in the early morning light Daniel could see movement. Other dragons, dozens of them in colors ranging from deep green to rusty red to midnight blue. Families, he realized. A whole community living in this secret place. Ash circled the valley once, calling out in a complex series of vocalizations. Several dragons answered, their voices creating a song that echoed off the mountain walls. Then Ash landed near the lake's edge, folding wings with a satisfied rumble. Daniel slid off the dragon's back on legs that shook from adrenaline and emotion. He stood at the edge of this hidden world, watching dragons move through their morning routines, playing in the water, sunning on rocks, tending to young ones. Life, happening without human observation or intervention, beautiful and complex and completely itself. Ash moved to the water and drank deeply, then returned to Daniel and made the questioning trill. I don't know what this means, Daniel admitted. I don't know if you're showing me this because you want me to understand your world, or if you're asking something else. I don't speak dragon well enough yet. Yet. The word surprised him, as if he was assuming there would be more time, more moments, a future that included this impossible friendship. The sun climbed higher, and Daniel knew the research team would be worried. His communicator had probably been buzzing non-stop, but he'd left it in the transport, not wanting anything to interrupt this moment. He should go back, should let them know he was alive, should return to his shipping container and his job and his carefully maintained distance from everything that mattered. Should. But Ash was watching him with those eyes that saw more than they should, and the valley was beautiful, and for the first time since the war ended, Daniel didn't want to go back to merely existing. One more hour, he said, sitting on a flat rock near the water. Then I'll face reality again. Ash settled beside him, warm and solid, a living reminder that reality contained more possibilities than Daniel had let himself imagine. They sat together as the sun warmed the valley and other dragons went about their lives, and Daniel felt something he'd thought was gone forever start to stir in his chest. Hope. The settlement council chamber felt too small, too crowded, too full of faces looking at Daniel with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. He shifted in his seat, fighting the urge to leave, reminding himself that he'd chosen this, asked for this meeting, proposed something so unusual that the council had actually agreed to hear him out, which was either a good sign or meant they thought he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. Sane people didn't quit their jobs to live on the edge of a forest and communicate with dragons. Sane people didn't propose radical changes to settlement expansion, plans based on 3 weeks of watching intelligent creatures hunt and play and build complex social structures, but Daniel had stopped trusting sanity months ago. Sanity hadn't helped him heal. Routine hadn't fixed him. Distance hadn't made the nightmares stop. Maybe it was time to try something that looked crazy from the outside but felt more right than anything he'd done since before the war. Let me make sure I understand, Council Head Roberts said, leaning forward with her hands folded on the table. You want us to create a new position, Dragon Liaison. Your job would be to establish communication, protocols with the dragon population, and advise on expansion plans to avoid territorial conflicts. Yes, based on your experience with one dragon. Over the course of a few weeks, 3 weeks of intensive daily interaction, Daniel corrected, plus ongoing observation of a valley community with approximately 40 individuals showing clear social structures, communication patterns, and what appears to be tool use. Tool use? One of the other council members, an older man named Harrison, raised his eyebrows. These are animals. These are intelligent beings, Daniel said, keeping his voice even despite the frustration rising in his chest. I've watched them arrange stones to redirect water flow. I've seen them teach young ones to hunt with coordinated strategies. They have distinct personalities, family groups, and what looks like artistic expression. Artistic expression, Harrison repeated, his tone making clear what he thought of that claim. Daniel pulled out his tablet and brought up the photos he'd taken. Look at this. 3 dragons spent an entire afternoon arranging different colored stones in a spiral pattern near the waterfall. No practical purpose. They just did it, then sat back and vocalized to each other in ways that sounded like discussion or appreciation. If that's not art, what is it? The council members passed the tablet around, studying the images. Dr. Lin, who'd been invited to provide scientific context, spoke up from her seat in the observation area. I've reviewed Daniel's documentation. His observations are thorough and consistent with what little we know about these creatures. They do appear to have cognitive abilities beyond typical wildlife. The question isn't whether they're intelligent. It's whether that intelligence requires us to change our approach to expansion. And there it was, the real issue. The settlement was growing fast. The mining corporation that had been eyeing the mountains for months was pushing harder for approval. Space was limited on this planet and humanity needed resources. Dragons, no matter how interesting, were still just animals in the way of progress, except they weren't. And Daniel knew it. 3 months ago, a young dragon wandered close to the settlement perimeter, Daniel said, shifting tactics. We logged it as a random animal encounter, but I've since learned that wasn't random. That dragon was a scout. The valley community sent juveniles to observe us to assess the threat level. The room went quiet. They're watching us, Daniel continued. They're intelligent enough to recognize us as a potential danger and organized enough to gather information. We can either continue expanding blindly and eventually have a real conflict, or we can establish communication now while we still have the chance to build a relationship instead of just react to problems. You're proposing we limit our growth to accommodate animals, Harrison said flatly. I'm proposing we grow intelligently instead of destructively. We already have conflicts with local wildlife because we didn't take time to understand the ecosystem before building. The dragon territories in the mountains contain resources we want, but they also contain communities of beings who've lived here far longer than we have. There has to be a better way than just pushing them out. Robert studied Daniel for a long moment. This matters to you, more than I've seen anything matter to you since you came back from the war. Daniel met her eyes. Yes, why? The honest answer was complicated. Because Ash had somehow reached through his numbness. Because learning to communicate with a completely different form of intelligence had given him purpose. He'd thought was gone forever. Because for the first time in 3 years he woke up wanting to see what the day would bring instead of just wanting it to end. Because it's the right thing to do, Daniel said simply, and because I'm good at it. The council went into closed session. Daniel waited in the hallway, his leg bouncing with nervous energy. Dr. Lin joined him, offering a cup of terrible coffee from the machine. You did well in there, she said. Harrison thinks I'm insane. Harrison thinks everyone under 50 is insane. Roberts is the one who matters and she's listening. But will she agree? Dr. Lin shrugged. Honestly, I don't know. You're asking them to value something that doesn't have obvious economic benefit. That's a hard sell in a struggling settlement, but you made a compelling case. Daniel sipped the coffee, grimacing at the taste but grateful for something to do with his hands. His communicator buzzed. A message from Claire. Heard you're starting a revolution. Very proud. Also slightly worried you've joined a cult. Please confirm you have not joined a cult. Despite his nerves, Daniel smiled. He typed back quickly. In no cult. Just trying to do something that matters. We'll explain when you visit. Visit? I'm not visiting. I'm moving. Daniel stared at the screen. What? Got a job offer teaching at the settlement school. Accepted this morning. Figured if my brother is finally doing something interesting, I should be there to see it. Plus you clearly need supervision. Something warm and unfamiliar spread through Daniel's chest. His sister. Here. Not because he was broken and needed fixing, but because she wanted to be part of whatever came next. When? He typed. 2 weeks. Start panicking about cleaning your place now. Daniel was about to respond when the council chamber door opened. Roberts gestured for him to come back inside. The walk back to his seat felt longer than the hike to the Dragon Valley. All the council members wore professional, neutral expressions that gave nothing away. Daniel sat and waited, his heart doing complicated things in his chest. We've made a decision, Roberts said. The position of Dragon Liaison is approved, conditional. Daniel's breath caught. You'll have 6 months to establish clear communication protocols and demonstrate measurable progress in understanding dragon behavior and territory. You'll work with Dr. Lin's team to ensure scientific rigor, and most importantly, you'll train others. This can't be dependent on just you. We need a program that can grow. Agreed, Daniel said, probably too quickly. The mining corporation isn't going to like this, Harrison added. They'll push back hard. Let them push, Roberts said. We've already made too many mistakes rushing into things on this planet. Maybe it's time we tried learning before building for once. Daniel left the council building in a daze. The sun was setting, painting the settlement in shades of gold and purple. People moved through the streets heading home or to dinner or to whatever lives they were building. And for the first time since arriving here, Daniel felt like he might be building something too. He made his way to the forest edge, to the spot where Ash came most evenings. They'd fallen into a routine over the past weeks. Daniel would sit on a particular fallen log, and Ash would arrive from the valley, landing with a rush of wind that bent the nearby grass flat. Tonight was no different. The sun touched the horizon and Ash appeared, circling once before landing with familiar grace. The dragon made the questioning trill that meant something like, "How was your day?" "I got the job," Daniel said, reaching out to run his hand along Ash's neck. "Official dragon liaison. They're actually paying me to spend time with you," Ash rumbled with what sounded like approval. "Your community is going to have to get used to more humans," Daniel continued. "I need to train others. Show them what I've learned. Think you can handle that?" More people in the valley. The dragon's response was a complex series of vocalizations that Daniel was still learning to interpret. But the tone seemed cautiously positive, or at least not immediately negative. They sat together as the stars emerged, and Daniel felt something settle in his bones. Not peace exactly. Not the absence of trauma or the disappearance of difficult memories, but something better. Forward motion. Purpose. The sense that what he did tomorrow would matter to someone other than himself. His communicator buzzed again. This time it was Dr. Lin. "Saw the vote, congratulations. First training session is Monday if you're ready." "And Daniel?" "Thank you for caring enough to fight for this." Daniel looked up at the stars, then at Ash's profile outlined against the darkening sky. "I'm ready," he typed back, and for once, he meant it. The protest outside the settlement administration building was small but loud. About 30 people, many wearing mining corporation uniforms, held signs with slogans like "Jobs over beasts" and "Humans first." Daniel walked past them with his head down, trying to ignore the words being shouted in his direction. "Dragon lover. Traitor to your own species. We fought a war so humans could survive, not so we could bow to animals." That last one landed harder than the others. Daniel's hands clenched into fists, but he kept walking. Getting into arguments with angry workers wouldn't help anything. They were scared about their jobs, about their futures. He understood that even if he disagreed with their conclusions. Inside the building, the atmosphere was tense. The mining corporation had formally challenged the Dragon territory protections, and today's meeting would determine whether Daniel's 6-month probationary period got cut short or continued. He found Dr. Lin in the conference room reviewing data on her tablet. "Big crowd outside," Daniel said. "They've been there since dawn. The corporation is buzzing people in from other settlements." Dr. Lin's expression was grim. "They're making this about jobs versus conservation, framing it like we're choosing dragons over people, aren't we?" The question came from across the room. Councilmember Harrison entered carrying a thick folder. 500 jobs in those mountains? Good-paying jobs. Jobs that could stabilize our economy. And we're saying no because of some interesting animals. Intelligent beings with established communities," Daniel corrected. "And we're not saying no to mining. We're saying find different sites that don't require destroying their homes. Every site has someone's home. Birds, insects, whatever. We can't halt all progress because creatures lived somewhere first." Before Daniel could respond, Roberts entered with the corporation representative, a sharp-dressed woman named Patricia Okonkwo who'd built her reputation on aggressive expansion strategies across 3 colonies. "Let's begin," Roberts said, settling into her seat. "Ms. Okonkwo, you have the floor." Patricia stood, activating a holographic display that showed mineral surveys and economic projections. The northern mountain range contains deposits worth approximately 40 million credits. Extraction would provide 500 direct jobs and an estimated 1,500 indirect positions. It would stabilize our economy for the next decade and make this settlement attractive for further investment. She pulled up another image, a map of the territory with the Dragon Valley marked in red. This area, which Mr. Reed has designated as protected, sits directly on top of the most valuable deposits. Moving to alternative, sites would reduce yields by 60% and increase cost to the point where the operation becomes economically unviable. There are other mountains, Daniel said, with inferior deposits and greater technical challenges. The northern range is the only practical option. Patricia turned to face him directly. I understand you've formed an attachment to these creatures, but we need to be realistic. Humanity's survival on this planet depends on economic stability. We can't afford to prioritize animals over our own species. They're not just animals. They're not human, Patricia countered, and that has to matter. I respect what you're trying to do, truly, but 500 families need those jobs. People who fought in the war, who lost homes on Earth, who came here hoping to build something better. Are you really saying a dragon community matters more than they do? The question hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Daniel felt the weight of everyone's eyes on him. This was the core of it, wasn't it? The impossible choice between human needs and the rights of another intelligent species. I'm saying there has to be a solution that doesn't require destroying one to save the other, Daniel said finally. That's a nice sentiment, Harrison interjected. But we live in the real world. Resources are limited. Tough choices have to be made. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, growing more heated as it went. Patricia presented economic models. Daniel countered with behavioral data showing the dragon's intelligence and social complexity. Dr. Lin provided scientific context, trying to remain neutral but clearly sympathetic to Daniel's position. The council members asked questions, their own opinions becoming increasingly clear. By the time they broke for lunch, Daniel felt exhausted. He stepped outside, needing air, and immediately regretted it. The crowd had grown larger, and several people recognized him. How can you choose monsters over people? My family needs those jobs. You're supposed to be a hero. Daniel pushed through them, heading for the quiet space behind the building. But a hand caught his arm. He spun, ready to defend himself, and found himself facing a man about his age wearing an old military jacket. Hey, sorry, the man said, releasing Daniel's arm and stepping back. I just wanted to talk. I'm Owen. I was at the second battle of Kelvin Station. Daniel recognized the haunted look in Owen's eyes. Fellow veteran, fellow survivor. Daniel, I know who you are. Owen glanced back at the crowd. Look, I'm not here to yell at you. I'm here because I need one of those jobs. I've got a kid and the temporary work I've been doing isn't cutting it. But he hesitated, I also understand why you're doing this. What you're trying to protect. Then why are you with them? Because I need to eat, Owen said simply. Because my daughter needs medicine that costs credits I don't have. Because I can't afford to care about dragons when I'm barely keeping my own family afloat. He met Daniel's eyes. But I'm asking you not as an enemy, just as someone who gets it. Is there really no compromise? No way both things can happen? Daniel wanted to say yes. Wanted to promise that he'd find a solution that gave Owen his job and kept the dragon safe. But he didn't know if that was possible. And lying to a fellow veteran felt worse than admitting uncertainty. I'm trying, was all he could offer. I'm really trying. Owen nodded slowly. That's more than most people do. Good luck in there. He walked back to the crowd, leaving Daniel alone with the weight of impossible expectations. The afternoon session started with more economic arguments, more territorial maps, more pressure to make a decision that would inevitably hurt someone. Daniel was preparing his counter-arguments when his communicator buzzed insistently. It was a message from Ash. Or rather, an alert from the monitoring beacon he'd attached to Ash's favorite perch in the valley. The dragon was calling him, using the pattern they'd established for urgent situations. Daniel stood abruptly. I need to go. We're in the middle of proceedings, Harrison said. It's an emergency. The Dragon Valley. Something's wrong. Robert studied him for a moment, then nodded. Go, but be back before we vote. Daniel ran from the building, ignoring the shouts from the crowd, and headed straight for his vehicle. The drive to the forest edge took 20 minutes that felt like hours. He abandoned the vehicle and ran the last quarter mile to their usual meeting spot. Ash was there, agitated and moving in tight circles. The dragon's vocalizations were sharp, urgent, distressed. Other dragons circled overhead, their calls creating a discordant symphony of alarm. What's wrong? Daniel asked, though he didn't expect an answer he could understand. Ash moved to him and lowered its body in the flight position. The message was clear. Come with me. Now. They flew faster than ever before, Ash's wings beating with desperate speed. The other dragons followed, forming a V formation like migratory birds. They flew past the valley, past the familiar territories, deep into the mountains where Daniel had never been. And then he saw it. An old structure, half buried in the mountainside. Human design but not recent. Pre-settlement construction. As they got closer, Daniel's blood went cold. He recognized the architectural style from his military training. Kavrath. Ash landed near the entrance, and Daniel slid off on shaking legs. The structure was a monitoring station, the kind the Kavrath used for planetary observation. But this one was still active. Lights blinked on dusty equipment. Power hummed through old systems, and in the center of the main chamber, clearly visible through the partially collapsed roof, sat 3 cylindrical containers marked with symbols Daniel had hoped never to see again. Biological weapons. His hands shook as he pulled out his communicator and took photos, his mind racing through implications. The Kavrath had planned contingencies. If they lost the war, they'd planted weapons to ensure humanity's victory would be hollow. This station was supposed to activate and release toxins into the planet's water system, making the colony uninhabitable. But it hadn't activated. And as Daniel looked around, understanding dawned. The dragons' territorial behavior, their aggression toward anyone who came near these mountains, their protective presence in this specific area, they'd been guarding it. Maybe not understanding what it was, but recognizing danger and keeping humans away from it. The dragons hadn't been in the way of humanity's survival. They'd been protecting it. The emergency council session started at midnight. Daniel stood at the front of the chamber, exhausted and covered in dust from exploring the Kavrath facility, while council members filed in looking confused and annoyed at being woken. Patricia Okonkwo arrived last, her expression suggesting this better be worth interrupting her sleep. "This is highly irregular," Harrison began, but Roberts cut him off. "Daniel sent photos 2 hours ago. We've had experts analyzing them. If what we're seeing is accurate, irregular doesn't begin to cover it." She nodded to Daniel. "Show them." Daniel activated the holographic display and the room filled with images of the facility. The Kavrath architecture, the active systems, the biological weapon containers with their unmistakable threat symbols. "This is the northern mountain range," Daniel said, his voice hoarse. "Specifically, it's inside the territory we've been arguing about. The dragons have been living around this facility for years. Their aggressive territorial behavior that we documented, their unwillingness to let humans near certain areas, it wasn't random animal aggression." He pulled up more images, showing the facility's location relative to the settlement's water source. If these weapons had activated, toxins would have entered the main river system within days. The settlement would have been poisoned before we knew what was happening. Everyone here would be dead. Silence filled the chamber. "The dragons were protecting us," Dr. Lin said quietly from her seat. "All this time?" Patricia leaned forward, studying the images. "How do we know these weapons are still viable?" "The war ended 3 years ago. Maybe they're inert." "The containment systems are still powered and functional," Daniel replied. "Our weapons specialist confirmed at least 2 of the 3 containers are still sealed and pressurized. One appears to be leaking, which might explain why dragons avoid going directly inside the facility." He pulled up technical readouts. "These weapons were designed to remain viable for decades. They're a long-term insurance policy. If we'd started mining operations up there, hitting this facility with heavy equipment." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room could imagine the result. Harrison cleared his throat, looking pale. "So the mining operation would have killed us all? Not intentionally, but yes. If we disturbed those containers without proper hazmat protocols, the settlement would be gone within a month." Patricia sat back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Well, that changes things." The rest of the night passed in a blur of technical discussions and emergency protocols. Military specialists were called in to assess the facility. Evacuation plans were drafted in case the situation destabilized. And through it all, Daniel kept thinking about Ash, about the dragons circling overhead while he explored the facility, about how close humanity had come to destroying the very beings who'd been silently keeping them safe. By dawn, several things had been decided. The facility would be secured and the weapons safely removed. The northern mountains would be designated a protected zone, not just for the dragons but as a memorial to how close disaster had come, and the mining corporation would be compensated for their lost opportunity, with priority access to newly surveyed deposits in the southern range, which weren't as rich but were significantly safer. "There's one more thing," Robert said as the meeting finally wound down. Daniel, your probationary period is over. The liaison position is permanent, and we're authorizing expansion of your program. You mentioned needing to train others? Yes, to build trust with the dragon population, to document their territories properly to prevent future conflicts. Do it. Full funding, whatever you need. Roberts looked tired but determined. We almost made a catastrophic mistake because we didn't take time to understand what we were dealing with. Let's make sure that doesn't happen again. Patricia approached Daniel as people filed out of the chamber. I owe you an apology. I came here thinking you were a sentimental idealist choosing animals over people. That wasn't fair. You were trying to help people who needed jobs, Daniel said. That's not wrong. But my approach was, I should have listened instead of just pushing. She extended her hand. The corporation will work with your program. Share survey data, coordinate expansion plans, whatever you need to keep both humans and dragons safe. Daniel shook her hand, surprised by how much her change of heart meant. Thank you. As he left the building, the sun was rising over the settlement. The protest crowd from yesterday was gone. The streets were quiet except for early shift workers heading to their jobs. Daniel's communicator buzzed with messages. His sister demanding details. Dr. Lin sending coordination plans. Even Owen, the veteran from the crowd, thanking him for finding a solution. But Daniel just wanted to see Ash. He drove to the forest edge and hiked to their meeting spot. His body heavy with exhaustion, but his mind strangely clear. Ash was there, waiting on the fallen log like this was just another normal morning. The dragon made the questioning trill that meant, "Are you okay?" "I'm good," Daniel said, sinking down next to his friend. "We're good. They're protecting your territory. No mining, no destruction. You and your family are safe." Ash rumbled with what Daniel had learned to recognize as relief. They sat together as the sun climbed higher, warming the forest and the settlement and the mountains beyond. Daniel thought about the journey that had brought him here, the war that had broken him, the numbness that had followed, the night he'd decided to help an injured creature instead of letting it die. Every choice, every difficult moment had led to this. "You saved me," Daniel said quietly. "I know you don't understand the words, but I need to say them anyway. I was drowning and you gave me a reason to surface, to breathe, to try." Ash's head turned toward him, those intelligent eyes meeting his with something that looked like understanding. "I'm going to train others," Daniel continued. "Teach them what you've taught me. About patience, about communication, about how intelligence comes in forms we don't always recognize. There's going to be more humans in the valley. Is that okay?" The dragon's response was a complex vocalization that Daniel had started to recognize as cautious agreement. Not excitement, but willingness. Trust that Daniel wouldn't bring danger to the community. Over the following weeks, Daniel's program took shape. He recruited 5 others to train as liaisons, including Owen, who turned out to have a natural gift for reading dragon behavior. Claire arrived from her teaching job and immediately joined the education initiative, developing curriculum for settlement children about coexistence and conservation. The work was challenging. Not all dragons trusted humans easily. Not all humans understood why protecting dragon territory mattered. There were setbacks, misunderstandings, moments when Daniel wondered if what they were building was sustainable or just a temporary solution to permanent problems. But there were victories too. A young dragon injured in a territorial dispute who let Daniel's team treat it because it recognized their careful approach. A family of settlers who relocated a building site after liaisons identified it as a dragon nesting area. Small bridges built one interaction at a time between 2 species learning to share a planet. 6 months after the emergency council session, Daniel stood in the Dragon Valley with his training group, watching Ash teach a juvenile dragon the complex aerial maneuvers that adults used for long-distance flight. The young dragon struggled, faltered, tried again. Patient and persistent, exactly like Daniel had been when learning Ash's language. "How long did it take you to understand them?" Owen asked, watching the dragons with wonder. "I'm still learning," Daniel admitted. "Every day I understand a little more. But the important part isn't perfect communication. It's the willingness to try, to listen, to accept that there are different ways of being intelligent." Claire joined them, leading a group of children on an observation tour. She'd been nervous the first time bringing kids near dragons, but Ash and the others seemed to understand these were young humans, responding to them with the same patience they showed their own juveniles. "Uncle Danny, can I ask the dragons a question?" One of the kids raised her hand like she was in class. "You can try," Daniel said. "But remember, they might not answer in words. Watch their body language." The girl approached Ash carefully, the way Daniel had taught all of them. "Are you happy we're here?" Ash tilted its head, considering the small human. Then the dragon spread its wings wide, not threatening but welcoming, creating a shadow that encompassed the entire group. The rumble that followed was deep and resonant, the sound Ash made when everything was right in the world. "I think that's a yes," the girl said, delighted. As the group moved on to observe other dragons, Daniel felt his sister's hand on his shoulder. "You did this," Claire said softly. "You built this bridge." "Ash did it," Daniel corrected. "I just learned to walk across." "You learned to live again," Claire said. "That's what you really did." She was right, Daniel realized. Somewhere between that first night in the holding cell and this moment in the valley, he'd stopped just surviving. The nightmares hadn't disappeared. The memories of the war still hurt. But they didn't define him anymore. He'd found something bigger than his trauma, something worth building toward instead of just running from. That evening, after the training session ended and the others headed back to the settlement, Daniel stayed behind with Ash. They'd fallen into a comfortable routine of these quiet moments, just sitting together as the sun set and the valley settled into night. "I'm speaking at the Galactic Council next month," Daniel said, watching the first stars appear. "They want to hear about the liaison program, how we're building coexistence with intelligent non-spacefaring species. It's terrifying and exciting, and I have no idea how to address a room full of alien diplomats." Ash made an amused chuff, as if to say, "You'll figure it out. You have more faith in me than I have in myself." The dragon bumped Daniel's shoulder gently, a gesture that meant affection, trust, friendship, all the things Daniel had thought he'd lost forever. "Thank you," Daniel said, not for the first time and certainly not for the last, "for seeing something in me worth saving, for being patient while I learned, for teaching me the difference between surviving and living." Ash settled down beside him, warm and solid and alive. Around them, the valley hummed with the sounds of dragon families settling in for the night, young ones playing their last games before sleep, adults discussing the day and their complex vocalizations, a community thriving because humans had finally learned to listen instead of just expand. Daniel leaned back against Ash's shoulder and looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there, the Galactic Council was waiting to hear humanity's story, waiting to learn what they'd discovered on this colony world, and Daniel would tell them the truth. That humanity's greatest achievement wasn't conquering the Kavrath, wasn't spreading across the stars, wasn't building settlements or mining resources or claiming territory. It was learning, finally, to recognize intelligence in forms they didn't expect, to build relationships instead of just taking what they wanted, to understand that strength wasn't about domination but about coexistence. One broken soldier and one wounded dragon had started something that would ripple across the galaxy. Proof that different forms of intelligence could not just coexist, but protect each other. That the vulnerable could become strong through connection. That healing wasn't about forgetting trauma, but about finding purpose beyond it. Daniel closed his eyes and let himself feel the moment fully. The warmth of his friend beside him, the cool evening air on his face, the sounds of life continuing all around him. The knowledge that tomorrow would bring new challenges but also new possibilities. He'd survived the alien war but lost himself in the process. And then a dragon had taught him something no human could. That living wasn't about the absence of pain. It was about finding reasons to move forward despite it. About building connections. About protecting what mattered. About finally truly being alive. The stars wheeled overhead and Daniel Reed, former combat medic, dragon liaison, and bridge between species, smiled at the sky and felt, for the first time in years, at peace with who he was and what he'd become.